Good morning. So welcome to today's practice online. And so as previously we did it, so we will go through a presentation and we will also look at virtual slides together. So we will be working with the presentation, which you can find on VUCA, and we will be working with the workbook that you also have available on VUCA. We will go through the 2 chapters for this week and the next week as well. I think we can manage it in one lesson like this. We will have the chat going on here. So if you have any questions during hi, good morning. If you have any questions during the lesson, please just write them here, and I will check it once in a while because I don't have 2 monitors anyways. So that's it, and I hope the technical part will be working fine. So one more thing on VUCA, apart from the presentation from me, you also have a file with some theoretical descriptions from Lucy. So this one will look like this. So first of all, you will have this presentation, like this stream available online. You have your workbook, you will have the presentation, plus here you have some theoretical texts to go through for this lesson as well, available on VUCA. And this file labeled imunitní systém, for some reason it's in Czech. So this one is also a very nice overview of the slides that we will, some of the slides that we will go through. So that's also very useful for repetition. We will be working with histology guide today. So histology guide and some pictures from this as well, maybe. So, which practice is this? Yeah, so this is the first one. The presentation is in the non-specific immunity practice, and it's the immune system practice, like in general, the whole immune system, and it's the new one with the spaceship. So you can download it, and I will start so that we can finish this whole thing today. So we will be talking about organs and tissues of the immune system today, and we will cover first the non-specific immunity and specific immunity afterwards. So these are 2 types of immunity that we will be talking about, and they are located in different regions of your body, and the specific immunity often has like distinct organs to itself. So I hope everybody found the presentation. Yes, hopefully. Perfect. So let's start with the non-specific immunity. So it's also called innate immunity, and that means that this type of defense of your body doesn't require anything, doesn't require previous exposure to the bad guys, the antigens of the viruses or bacteria or whatever. So you are born with this, and you don't need to meet the bacterium or the virus before to be able to recognize it is not welcome. And this enables the system to be very quick. So it doesn't need to activate, analyze the signal. It just reacts really rapidly. And so the non-specific immunity has many options how to protect your body. So it could be very simple. It could be just physical barriers protecting you from the outside, from all the pathogens that could get into your body. So that could be mucosa and the epithelium. So epithelium is lining both the outside of your body, the skin, and the inside cavities as well. So it's protecting you from pathogens. Then you can have biological barriers, which could be, for example, an example of the symbiotic microorganisms in your gut. So these bacteria, these nice bacteria, live in your intestine, and they are important for you to be able to not be overrun by bacteria that are not so nice. So, for example, lactobacillus is living in your intestine, and it's very important that it is there. Then you can have chemical barriers. We will mention again, for example, the goblet cells. So the mucus that some cells can be producing in the epithelium, this mucus will also be protecting you from the pathogens. So, for example, if you think about the lung, where you will have goblet cells producing mucus in the airway, it will all the microorganisms will get stuck in the mucus, and they will be moved by the kinocelia out of the lungs, so that you don't get inflammation inside the lung. And some cells inside the epithelia or inside connective tissue can produce some special compounds that will be able to just non-specifically kill, for example, bacteria. So in this case, that could be lysozyme, which is a special enzyme which will be produced by Paneth cells. We will take a look at those. Those will be present in the intestine, and they produce this lytotic enzyme that will degrade bacteria non-specifically. So non-specific immunity still. Also, cytokines, mediators of the inflammatory response, are part of this immune system subpart, and others like histamine, which we will talk about when we see basophils and mast cells, which you could remember maybe already from some other lessons, and eosinophils will also be producing lytic enzymes that will be helping us fight non-specifically everything that invades our body. And of course, part of this is also the system for phagocyting the intruder bacteria, for example. And in this case, the most common cells are the macrophages, and we also have natural killer cells as part of the immune system, and antigen presenting cells. So once you destroy the bacterium, you, for example, phagocyte it, then you need to let the rest of the immune system know what kind of bacteria it was. So you present parts of the antigens to other cells, and that we will get there in the specific immunity part of the lecture. Let me see if everything is clear. I hope so. So, what cells are involved in the non-specific immunity we already mentioned, and we will have in your workbook we will have some pictures from electron microscope. So we can start with those, because we have one picture of mast cell and one picture of eosinophil. So we will start with the mast cell. So if you take a look at your workbook, so it's at the end of the immune system part. So if you go down, at the end of the second lesson, you will start seeing these pictures from electron microscope, and one of them, the last one, will be the mast cell. So let's just quickly talk about this one. So mast cell, you can find it in your workbook, and I also have it here in the presentation. So mast cells are similar to basophilic granulocytes, and they so the difference between basophilic granulocyte and mast cell is their localization, because the mast cell will be located in loose connective tissue and the basophilic granulocyte will be in the blood. And what can we say about this picture from electron microscope? So we have a cell here. So this is the plasma membrane going around. Here you have some appendages, so it suggests that it might be, traveling around. And inside the cytoplasm you see a nucleus. So it's this part of the cell. The nucleus has a lot of heterochromatin, the electron dense parts here, the darker ones, which means that the cell is not very proteosynthetically active. Then what's very prominent here are these dark granules inside the cytoplasm. So both the mast cell and the basophil, they will have these dark granules in the cytoplasm, and these granules will have inside them histamine and heparin. Histamine and heparin, I might write it down here. Histamine, heparin. And so these compounds are important for activating the immune system, and heparin is blood thinner, so it makes it easier for other immune cells to get there. Histamine, from allergies, so it's the compound that makes you a little bit itchy. So these are the dark granules. And then what else? You have some other structures in the cytoplasm, but they are not very clear, but you would have all the other organelles. So this could be mitochondria, for example, some other vesicles. And in the surrounding tissue you can see collagen fibrils. So collagen fibrils around here, and this tells us that we are located in connective tissue. So this is a mast cell. So that's basically everything that we can see here on this picture. Then another cell of the non-specific immunity that you have in your workbook before the mast cell is the eosinophilic granulocyte. So basophilic granulocyte would have histamine and heparin, dark granules, and it would be, for example, responsible for allergies. Eosinophilic granulocyte is responsible for fighting parasites, so bigger pathogens, meaning like small worms and stuff like this. And it's very distinctive on the picture from electron microscope, because you straight away see these weird granules. So you have granules which are lighter, electron lucid on the edges, and in the middle they have this crystallic core, which is very electron dense. So this is a specific image of the granules of an eosinophil. They will contain several different compounds that will be helping to kill the parasite, and also to signal other parts of the immune system that something is happening. You see a nucleus here, so both of these three parts are the nucleus, and you see that it's segmented. So it's different from the mast cell, which had just one quite oval nucleus. Here we have multiple segments of the nucleus that are connected by chromatin bridges. And what else can we see in the cytoplasm? We can see mitochondria here, here. It's not very nicely visible, but you can imagine the cristae here. You can see ribosomes, these small electron dense dots in the cytoplasm. Sometimes they form these small circles. So these would be the polyribosomes for synthesizing proteins for the cell itself. And you can see, of course, rough endoplasmatic reticulum. For example, here a little bit, the ribosomes are sitting on it. So just the organelles that every cell has, but the granules and the nucleus are quite special. So these were some... So we have a question about the mast cell, which is a good question. So I said that the mast cell looks like it has a lot of heterochromatin. And heterochromatin means it doesn't produce a lot of proteins for export. And at some point, of course, it had to synthesize all the proteins that are stored in the granules. But it produces these granules and then it's just waiting for the activation. It's waiting for the pathogen and it is not synthesizing anything almost. So this cell doesn't secrete all the time, like for example some cells that are producing hormones, but this cell is storing all the granules and then it just releases them at certain time and it will synthesize new proteins then. So the nucleus will change and it will despiralize the chromatin and it will produce new proteins to fill up new granules. So that's the reason. Also in the case of the eosinophil, it's pretty similar. So it's a lot of heterochromatin. It's storing the granules and they are ready for the time when the cell needs to fight the pathogens. So I hope that's clear. You're welcome. So, next group of cells that are able to fight non-specifically everything foreign that invades your body are cells that are phagocyting. Phagocytosis is the process where the cell engulfs the pathogen and then it's able to destroy it by lysosome enzymes, and then after all it's just excreted as debris. So macrophages are the most well-known cells like this. You have a macrophage on the GIF below and you can see that it's chasing around these tiny dots which are the bacteria and then it phagocytes them. So it's traveling around. In this case, it's in the blood because you see red blood cells around, and it's able to destroy the pathogens like this. We have different cells that are basically macrophages, but they have different names, but they have similar functions. So for example, Kupffer cells, which we met in the liver, basically macrophages doing the same thing, phagocytosis. Osteoclasts are a little bit different because they produce the lytic enzymes outside of the cell to destroy the bone. Microglia in the nervous system, similar role to macrophages. Alveolar macrophages we will take a look at in a while. They are located in the alveoli of the lung. And then you have antigen presenting cells. So from the destroyed bacterium, the cell will be able to display the antigens to the cells of the specific immune system, and these could be dendritic cells or Langerhans cells in the skin, which we will take a look at in a little while. So don't confuse Langerhans islets and Langerhans cells. Langerhans islets are in the pancreas and Langerhans cells will be in the skin. So the slides for the first part, what do we want to see? So first of all, we will take a look at spleen, and in spleen we will have a lot of macrophages. So we will take a look at macrophages in the spleen. Then we will take a look at macrophages in the lung, which are important, because you breathe in a lot of pathogens and dust, for example. Then we will take a look at the Langerhans cells in the skin, which are protecting you, and we will take a look at small intestine, where we will see goblet cells and the Paneth cells producing lysozyme. So in spleen, when you want to see the macrophages in spleen really nicely, you can use a special staining method. So this staining method is called the Pearls reaction. The Pearls reaction will stain the macrophages blue. So the resulting color is the Prussian blue, which we will see on the slide. only the macrophages will stain blue. And why is this possible? Because spleen, that we will be talking about also in the specific immunity part, spleen is also an organ where the old erythrocytes are degraded. Once they become less flexible after the approximately 120 days, because they don't have the nucleus, they get stuck in the spleen. And in the spleen, they are getting phagocyted by macrophages, the remains of these dying erythrocytes. And because the macrophages eat the red blood cells, they accumulate a pigment called hemosiderin. So hemo reminds you something to do with blood, and siderin some kind of pigment. So this is a pigment which has a lot of iron bound to it. Why iron? Because of course the red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which has a lot of iron ions bound to it. And this causes the hemosiderin to accumulate in the macrophages. So even in hematoxylin eosin staining, you could see them sort of brownish, the macrophages. But if we want to see them really nicely, we can use the Pearl's reaction. And in this reaction, something very complicated chemically happens, something like this. And because there is a lot of the the iron ions, cations, these ions will react with the stain and form the Prussian blue, insoluble blue compound, which will be showing you the macrophages. And because the hematosiderin is only in the macrophages, you will see them as the only blue thing in the tissue. So it would be looking like this. So we don't have, on histology guide, we don't have a slide of spleen with this type of staining. So this is this picture that you will have in the presentation is basically what you need to remember. So the spleen we will cover later, and in this part of the spleen you can see many accumulations of dark blue color. So these will be the macrophages that ate a lot of red blood cells, have hemosiderin in them and stained with the Prussian blue. So this is the Pearl's reaction, how it would look like. Checking the question. Yeah, one more question about the mast cell. Sorry that I'm getting to it so late. Yeah, so eosinophil, if you want to see the nucleus, it would have two lobes, sort of, for the eosinophil, and for the mast cell it's not called kidney shaped. I think kidney shaped is mentioned usually for monocytes, but it looks similar in this picture from electron microscope, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Yes, and now we are talking about the macrophages, and they are in the red pulp. Yes, we will get to that later on. So this is just so that you know that we have this special staining for macrophages. You have it in your workbook. So now so non-specific immunity, you should know the principle of the Pearl's reaction. So the iron cations in the hemosiderin getting stained blue, and we have seen the macrophages on the picture, and that's it for spleen. Now we will just quickly take a look at the lungs and the macrophages in lungs as well, and then we will get on to the skin. So in the lungs, it's important in the alveoli and everywhere to have this kind of non-specific immunity as well. And we have a lot of macrophages here, which are also sometimes called dust cells, because a lot of dust and small particles get into the lungs, and these macrophages usually eat them up, and sometimes they become quite dark because of this. For example, if you were working in a mine, your lung macrophages would be quite, blackish. So this is what we will be looking for. I will open the slide in the histology guide and we will take a look at the lungs. And so inside the alveolus, so this is the wall of the alveolus with capillaries inside, and this is the lumen of the alveolus, and inside the lumen some big cell with like foamy cytoplasm will be sitting and waiting for the pathogens. So let's take a look. Yes, let's take a look in the histology guide, and I have the lung here. Yes, so if we take a look at the lung, we see some bigger airways, but we want to go inside the alveoli, inside the part where you really have the respiration happening. Here it's kind of slow. Sorry. So here, if we zoom in, so we will see the walls of the alveoli, and we will see some cells inside the alveoli which will be bigger than the rest. So for example, this one, or this one, or this one. So they have some accumulated debris in their cytoplasm. You can see it. Let me find a nice example. Maybe these three guys here. So you can see some kind of darker material in the cytoplasm. So these would be the dust cells, the alveolar macrophages inside your lungs. So this is the wall of the alveolus with pneumocytes type 1 and type 2 in the wall, and capillaries. And inside the lumen, if you find some kind of these big cells, you will be able to say that these are the lung macrophages. This as well, these as well. Sometimes they can even have more than one nucleus, but this is not the case here. Yeah, so for the lung in general, you should be able to recognize pneumocytes type 1 and pneumocytes type 2. So if we take a look and find a nice area. So in theory, the pneumocytes type 1 are squamous. And cells that are squamous will also have a squamous nucleus. So the cells will be more like this. And the nucleus will be elongated as well. So this would be pneumocyte type 1. And pneumocyte type 2 would be sitting in the wall of the alveolus, but it would be more roundish. And it would be producing the surfactant. So this is the ideal idea of this. Of course, it's never so nice in here. But you can still find cells that have elongated nucleus, like this. So these would be pneumocytes type 1, and these cells that are still inside the wall, so they are not the macrophages because they are part of the wall of the alveolus, but they are round. They will be the pneumocytes type 2. So you should be able to tell them apart, and the macrophages as well over here. So this is quite clear, I hope. And in the presentation here, the pneumocytes type 1, more squamous, type 2, sort of bulging into the alveolus. but sometimes it's quite hard to tell. I agree, but you can always find some nice example where it's really apparent, the difference. So let's continue. So this was the lung and the dust cells, and next on our list today is the skin. The skin we have already seen several times, but we can take, it never hurts to repeat it. And today we want to focus on Langerhans cells, which will be the immune cells inside the epidermis. Sorry. So, let's get back to the presentation. And I have this slide here as well, which is like more general again. And so skin will be one of the physical barriers. So the macrophages, they were the cells that were actively doing something, but the skin is also playing a role in just being a physical barrier between you and the environment. The same thing is happening, for example, in vagina, the mucosa, and some bacteria as well, protecting you. Small intestine, epithelium, and lamina propria in the mucosa layer, bronchus, lungs. We already saw this one. So in skin, just to review this, we have epidermis, which is the stratified, squamous, keratinizing epithelium, and the dermis, which is the connective tissue below. And directly below the epidermis, you have loose connective tissue. So here, right below the epithelium, you have loose connective tissue, which is called stratum papillare. So it's not called lamina propria here, just reminding you, we already talked about this, but stratum papillare, because the skin forms this papillae that you can see, for example, in case of your fingertips as the fingerprint doing papillae. I don't know how it's called in English, sorry. So stratum papillare is the important region because here you will have a lot of immune cells performing the immune reaction itself, but in epidermis you will have some special cells as well, Langerhans cells. And also keratinization is part of the function of the barrier. You have enzymes being produced and you have very tight junction between the cells of the top layers of the epithelium. So epidermis, reminding you here, we have the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, in case of thick skin, stratum granulosum, which is the dark one, dark purple cells accumulating granules here, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. So just a quick revision. So basale is the one on the bottom, then you have spinosum, granulosum, and stratum corneum. And the Langerhans cells that I already mentioned are antigen presenting cells. So they will meet the antigen and they will present parts of it to the cells of the specific immunity, so to lymphocytes, specifically to T lymphocytes. So they will catch the antigen and then they will move to lymph nodes where they will do the antigen presenting to the T lymphocytes. So Langerhans cells are inside the epithelium. So all of these cells that form the epithelium are called keratinocytes. So keratinocytes are all the cells of the epithelium, from the basal layer to the stratum corneum where they are already dead. And then you have Langerhans cells sitting between them. And if you have normal staining with hematoxylin eosin, it's impossible to find them. But if you use special immunohistochemistry methods, which enables you to stain specifically for Langerhans cells, you would see them like this. So you have the epithelium, and then you have stratum papillare, and then you have the rest of the dermis, and inside the epithelium you have purple nuclei of the keratinocytes, the normal cells of the epithelium, and then you have these guys branching out here, the antigen presenting cells called Langerhans cells. So this is what we want to see for our workbook. So you remember the epidermis, you should remember the layers of it, and we can see on this picture the immunohistochemically identified Langerhans cells. Otherwise you will not be able to find them, so don't worry about it. You should know that they are there. That's it. And then we should take a look at stratum papillare, where we have the loose connective tissue. So that's where you would have all the other cells playing a role in the immune response of the non-specific immune system in the skin. And so below the epidermis, in the stratum papillare of the dermis, in the loose connective tissue, you will have macrophages again. So phagocyting everything that got through anyway. Granulocytes, so the basophils, for example, mast cells. Mast cells here, the ones that we talked about with the histamine and heparin. Dendritic cells, another type of antigen presenting cells. Fibroblasts, of course, these are the cells that are producing the extracellular matrix, and Langerhans cells, which will be traveling from the epithelium into the lymph nodes. So Langerhans cells primarily in the epidermis, and in the loose connective tissue, all of these cells are sitting and waiting to destroy whatever comes in that we don't want there. So this was the second slide, the skin. We saw the epidermis layers. I don't think it's necessary to open the skin slide in histology guide. I think we saw it many times. And Langerhans cells we saw with the immunohistochemical staining, and dermis with all the other cells. So this is the important picture from this part. So Langerhans cells sitting with their processes going in between the keratinocytes in the stratified squamous keratinizing epithelium. So antigen presenting cells inside the skin, inside the epithelium of skin. So okay, what staining is used to stain the Langerhans cells? So it's enough to just know that it's immunohistochemical staining, because immunohistochemistry is, in principle, you have special antibodies for special proteins. So this would be an antibody which is specific for a protein that is produced by the Langerhans cells and not by any of the other cells. But you can have antibodies for all different kinds of special cells, so you don't have to worry about it. It doesn't have a special name. It's just immunohistochemical method. So that's it. That's all you have to know. So that's the skin, and if we continue, we should be focusing on the small intestine. So small intestine we have also met before. So we have the villi coming into the lumen. The villi are lined with simple columnar epithelium, and then you have the crypts going into the lamina propria. So lamina propria is inside the villi and between the crypts, and in the epithelium lining the villi we will see goblet cells, so important. The mucus will be protecting us as well, and inside the crypts, on the bottom of the crypts, we will have the Paneth cells. And Paneth cells will be producing the lysozyme, which will be specifically degrading the bacterial cells that get into your intestine. We also have Peyer's patches, which is part of the specific immunity, so we will get to that later. So this is nothing very new. So the villi we see here in the small intestine, the simple columnar epithelium, and these round light regions are the cytoplasm of the goblet cell. So the goblet cells are producing mucus, therefore the cytoplasm is very light because the mucus is fatty and it washes out during the preparation of the slide, it doesn't stain. And here at the bottom of the crypts you can find the Paneth cells. The Paneth cells, they produce enzymes, and enzymes are proteins. So proteins are, so these cells would not need to be on top because their secretion will be very liquid. It's not mucus, so it's able to get out of the crypt. So they could be at the bottom, and if we zoom in, they can look like this if they stain in this red way, but usually they are not this nicely stained. So this is the crypts, this is lamina propria between the crypts, and at the bottom you have a group of Paneth cells which are producing lytic enzymes such as lysozyme, which will be degrading the bacteria that got into your intestine. Is there a difference of stratum papillare and general loose connective tissue? Does loose connective tissue in other areas contain same amount of immune cells? Yes, so that's a good question. So stratum papillare is the equivalent of lamina propria in skin. And it's not a special connective tissue, it's quite normal, because in all the parts where you have loose connective tissue underneath epithelium, so it's either lamina propria or this stratum papillare, you will have quite a large amount of immune cells, because it's somewhere where you have a surface that needs to be protected, because you have a contact with the outer environment. So the amount of immune cells in lamina propria, for example, here in the intestine and in the skin will be similar, the amount of immune cells. So, but that's a good question, thanks. So if we take a look at the workbook, we should be able in small intestine to find the lamina epithelialis. So that's the simple columnar epithelium, lamina propria, which is the loose connective tissue inside the villi and between the crypts, and lamina muscularis we already know, but let's take a look quickly on the histology guide slide of small intestine. So this is a nice cross-section of the small intestine, and you see the villi going into the lumen of it. Then we have the crypts here, and this will be the muscle layer. So if we zoom in, so you should be able to find the epithelium. So this is the columnar epithelium lining the villi and going inside the crypts as well. So how to recognize the difference between the villi and the crypts is that the villi have empty space between them, but the crypts, they just have connective tissue around them, no more empty spaces. So this is where the villus would end, and here is where you would have the crypts. So lamina epithelialis are all these cells sitting on the basement membrane, and some of them will be goblet cells. So let's take a look if we have a nice example, for example here. So these are the enterocytes, normal columnar cells with brush border, and this would be a goblet cell. This would be a goblet cell. So the nucleus is pushed to the bottom, and you have accumulation of mucus that's being produced into the space between the villi. So it's very lightly stained. So goblet cells, part of the protection of your intestine as well. And if we go deep into, let me zoom out, into the crypts, very slow, sorry. So you would find the Paneth cells here in the lowest parts of the crypts. So for example here, if you find the bottom of the crypt, and even though these are not stained red, you can say that these are the Paneth cells producing the lysozyme. Check the questions. No questions. Perfect. So Paneth cells, you can always find them at the bottom of the crypts, and goblet cells inside the epithelium, where you see these lighter parts where the mucus is not stained. So this is quite easy because you have already seen this before. And then, wow, this is not very nice. Then the lamina propria is all that you see inside the villi. So you see many cells here. So it's loose connective tissue with many immune cells, many blood vessels, some smooth muscle cells, fibroblasts, of course, stuff like that. So lamina propria is inside the villi, and if we go down here, it will be between the crypts as well. So all of this is lamina propria. You will have macrophages, you will have mast cells, everything. So lamina propria. Then you have lamina muscularis mucosae, so the thin layer of smooth muscle. Then you have submucosa. This is, it looks very different from the slides that we had during our practices from our boxes, but you don't have to worry about it. So this is dense connective irregular tissue with blood vessels, and this is smooth muscle. So one layer of smooth muscle, second layer of smooth muscle here, and then you have tunica serosa. So again, connective tissue on the outside. So that's just a quick review of the small intestine. So Paneth cells, you will be looking for them at the bottom of the mucosa. Goblet cells, of course, in the epithelium lining the villi. Smooth muscle here, submucosa here. Okay. So we saw everything for the small intestine, and we can switch to the specific immunity, which will be a little bit more complicated. It will be like bigger organs that we haven't really seen before. So this was the easier part, and now let's go to specific, or also it's called adaptive immunity. So the specific immunity is not automatic. It requires immunization. And immunization means that you have already met the pathogen before, and you know that you should react to it. And the reaction will be carried out by the specific immune system. The disadvantage of this is that it takes longer, of course, because if you non-specifically phagocyte everything that's foreign, it can be done really quickly. If you need to process this information, produce antibodies, it takes a longer time, but it is very flexible. So you can very specifically react to different dangers, and this is a Czech word, I'm sorry, auto correct or something. So this system, its advantage is also that it remembers what happened before, what you have already met, and the next time you will meet it, you will be prepared better. So that's the principle of it, and the organs of the specific or adaptive immunity will have connective tissue stroma, and then it will have typically lymphocytes, so immune cells sitting inside this stroma. So stroma, once again, important word for you, is the non-functional part of the organ. So it's just the sort of net that is holding all the cells that are really doing the work, which are the immune cells, and the immune cells will therefore be called the parenchyme. So stroma and parenchyme. And so we will be talking about two types of lymphatic organs. The lymphatic organs can be either primary or secondary. And the primary lymphatic organs are called primary because it's the location where the immune cells are being produced and where they mature. So this is thymus for T lymphocytes and bone marrow for B lymphocytes. So we will take a look at thymus as an example of primary lymphatic organ. So that's where the T lymphocytes will be produced. And secondary lymphatic organs, we have more of these, and these are the places where you have the already mature immune cells and where they are actually doing the immune reaction. So these can be also divided once more into three groups, because they can have a capsule, or they don't have a capsule, or they have a partial capsule. So capsule is the connective tissue layer around the whole organ, and this will be the case for lymph nodes and the spleen, which we have already mentioned, and non-capsulated, so no capsule at all, will be the pair plaques in the intestine. So also appendix, but we will not be looking at that today. But pair plaques will be just immune cells with no capsule inside the wall of the intestine. So it's inside the wall of the intestine, so it doesn't need a capsule. It's not an organ on its own. So lymph nodes and spleen are encapsulated. Plaques, pairs plaques, no. And partially capsulated will be tonsils. So we will get to that. Tonsils, you can imagine, for example, we will take a look at tonsilla palatina, which is the tonsils that you see when you open your mouth and check if you're, sick or something. So these will be on one side, they will be covered with something that will be the epithelium that you have in your oral cavity, and on the other side they will not be covered by anything. So they will be partially capsulated. Let me check if it's clear. It seems to be clear. Perfect. And the cells that will be playing the role of the specific immunity will be mostly T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. So we have one more picture from electron microscope or two more pictures, that you have in your workbook. So if you again scroll down to the end, you will see a picture of lymphocyte from electron microscope and plasma cell. So the lymphocyte, this picture is quite straightforward. There's not much to talk about. So this is the specific morphology of all lymphocytes. You cannot tell under electron microscope or under light microscope if it's T or B lymphocyte. You would need again immunohistochemistry. So you would need an antibody for some special proteins that are present in only T or only B lymphocytes, but you cannot say which one it is like that. But all of them will have a big nucleus. It will be round, and it's also very heterochromatic because it's not activated right now. So it doesn't produce very many proteins for export, makes sense. And the cytoplasm just forms this thin ring around the nucleus, and that's where you will have all the other organelles. So you see ribosomes, you might see a mitochondria here, and that's pretty much it. There will be everything, but it's quite tightly packed here. So you should be able to recognize this is a lymphocyte. And the other picture is the plasma cell. And the plasma cell is the differentiated B lymphocyte. So this is, we don't have time to go through all the theory, but you probably know that the T lymphocytes are, for example, T helper cells, stuff like that, and B lymphocytes, when they are activated, they become plasma cells. And plasma cell has the sole role, and that is to produce antibodies. And this is why the morphology of the cell is changed so much. So it used to be a lymphocyte, B lymphocyte like this, and it became a plasma cell. So what happened to the cell? So we can see that the nucleus has a lot of euchromatin now. So it's much more euchromatin than we saw in the lymphocyte. So it means it's producing a lot of proteins for export. The organization of the heterochromatin and euchromatin is quite distinctive. It's not so perfectly visible here, but it's called the clock face shape. So it kind of looks like a clock if you have a very good imagination. And importantly, the nucleus is not located in the center of the cell, which is the usual type of morphology, but it's pushed to the side, and it's pushed to the side because all of the cytoplasm here is filled with a lot of rough endoplasmatic reticulum. So plasma cell is producing a lot of antibodies, which are transcribed from euchromatin and then translated on the rough endoplasmatic reticulum. So that's what's happening here. That's why the nucleus is pushed to one side. You also have Golgi apparatus, of course, which will be somewhere in this part, this more messy part, and you can see mitochondria because you also need a lot of energy for all this transcribing and translating. So plasma cell is also quite easy to recognize, I would say. Sorry, I didn't want to. I wanted to check for questions. Okay, perfect. So that's the pictures from electron microscope. And what do we have for slides for this second part? So we will be taking a look at two of the capsulated secondary lymphatic organs. So lymph node and spleen will be the organs where the immune reaction is happening, and where we will have a capsule. Then we will take a look at thymus, which is the primary lymphatic organ, which will also have a capsule, but it will be the place where the T lymphocytes are being made. And then tonsilla palatina, the tonsils in your mouth, which will be covered with stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium, so partially capsulated, and finally the non-capsulated pairs, patches in the intestine. So that's our plan. What time is it? Hopefully we can manage. So let's start with the lymph node. So in the lymph node, it's capsulated, we already mentioned, so it will have a dense connective tissue forming a capsule around the whole organ. Another thing that we can differentiate in the lymph node is cortex and medulla. And between those two, we will have paracortex, which is like something close to the cortex, but almost in medulla. So that's what you have it says deep cortex here, but it's the same thing. So you have cortex and medulla inside, similar to all the other organs where we met something like this. And in the cortex, how you recognize this is cortex? Because we will see a lot of lymphatic follicles. So lymphatic follicles will be groups of packed B cells and also some antigen presenting cells that we will see in almost all the lymphatic organs, and they will be very easy to recognize, and you will see them in the cortex. Then we will have paracortex, where we don't see the lymphatic follicles, and we will have T cells here. So B cells are always in the lymphatic follicles. This will be always the same. T cells, they will have different localization, and in medulla we will have medullary sinuses and medullary cords. So we will get to that. The principle is that the lymph coming, so the lymphatic system brings the liquid, the lymph, from the tissues, and it is going through all the immune cells so that all the pathogens that are inside it can get recognized. So the afferent, so incoming vessels are on this side, on the side of the cortex, and then you will have vessels going through the cortex, and they will be going into the medulla and out of the whole lymph node. So the lymph is coming in here and going out here from the medulla. And in the medulla, the blood and also the lymph will be in medullary sinuses, which is like something like a blood vessel, but quite wide. And these sinuses will be between the medullary cords. So these will be cords of cells, and between them you will have spaces for going through of the lymph through the whole lymph node and out of it. So it sounds complicated, but it's not so horrible. We will take a look at it. Does cortex have antigen producing cells? Yes. So dendritic cells are antigen presenting cells. Yes. I didn't have that in there, so good question, thanks. And so what we want to recognize in a lymph node will be the cortex. So cortex, and here we will have the lymphatic follicles. So F stands for lymphatic follicles. So that's very easy to recognize. Then we will have paracortex, which is still not medulla, but it doesn't have the follicles, and medulla will be lighter with a lot of the vessels, so spaces for the lymph and a lot of blood vessels here. The capsule is going around the whole organ, so it's capsulated, we already know, and the capsule is coming into the organ and it's forming the so-called trabecules. So trabecule is part of the connective tissue capsule going into the tissue itself, and it's dense irregular connective tissue as usual. And one more thing that's specific for lymph node, and you also have it in your workbook, is subcapsular sinus. So the sinuses are the spaces where the lymph is flowing. So the lymph is coming into the lymph node from the capsule, and it's going into the tissue and it's flowing through the cortex into the medulla. And the beginning of this is when it goes from the capsule into the subcapsular sinus. So that's like an empty space right below the dense irregular connective tissue and between the capsule and the cortex with the lymphatic follicles. And in the medulla you will have cords of cells. So cord means like a line. So cells organized in these branching cords, and between them the empty spaces where the lymph is flowing are the medullary sinuses. So this is the theory of it, and let's take a look. Is it dendritic or follicular dendritic? I think it's in the follicle, so they will be called follicular dendritic cells, but it's still dendritic cells. It's just like how they are called. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but thanks for the question anyway. So, so we want to take a look at all of this on the slide. So in your workbook, let's go back. Specific immunity. So we should be able to see the cortex with the subcapsular sinus, the follicles, the lymphatic follicles inside the cortex. Between the follicles we will also have sinuses bringing the lymph through the cortex, and then we should recognize medulla, where we have the cords of the cells and between them the medullary sinuses. And vas afferens is the afferent lymphatic vessel which is going to the lymph node from the capsule. So let's open. We will get to the medullary sinuses. On the picture, they would be the empty spaces here between the cords of the cells, but we will take a look at the slide on the histology guide as well. So sinuses are the empty spaces and cords are the cells in the medulla. And so lymphoid system, and we want a lymph node here. So this would be an example of the lymph node, and you see these big round structures here. So these are the lymphatic follicles. So this will be the cortex. Here you don't see any follicles, so this will be the paracortex. And here in the middle we will have the medulla. So let's zoom in, for example, somewhere here. So the follicles, so that's the B dependent zone where you have the B lymphocytes. So these follicles, and you can see that they have like two shades, so they are darker here and lighter in the center. So if the center of the follicle is light like this, it means that the follicle is activated, and this is the proliferating center where the presentation of the antigen and the division of the cells is taking place. So this is the activated lymphatic follicle, this one as well. Most of the follicles that you will see will be already activated. And so this is the cortex of the lymph node with the follicles, and here you can see the connective tissue capsule. And this would be the trabecules going into the lymph node. So cortex here, and if we go so connective tissue capsule, and then you have here nicely visible subcapsular sinus. So these empty spaces right below the capsule are the sinuses. So the lymph is coming in from the capsule. So if you see, so these could be the afferent lymph vessels, and this is the subcapsular sinus. Then the lymph will be going through these spaces between the follicles, and it will be going into the region which no longer has follicles. So this will be the paracortex. So this is where you will have the T cells. And finally, it will get into this part, which is more loose and more light if you take a look at it from far. And if we zoom in, not very nice example, but anyway. So you will have these spaces between all the cells sitting in cords here, and this will be the medullary sinuses here as well. So all the spaces between the cells in this area will be the medullary sinuses, and the medullary cords will be these cells sitting around it. You also have a lot of blood vessels here. So this is the medulla in the center of the lymph node. This other region doesn't have the medulla. You can see that it's all cortex. It's cut on the side. So if you have cortex on the side and you cut just through the cortex, this is what you would see. Okay, what do I mean by B dependent? So the areas which contain B lymphocytes are called B dependent, and the areas which contain T lymphocytes are called T dependent. So B lymphocytes migrate from the bone marrow into these follicles in the cortex. T lymphocytes are located in the paracortex. So you can recognize that this is a lymph node because it has a capsule. So that's one criteria. Then you have lymphatic follicles. So it's an organ where the immune reaction is taking place, because this is where the B lymphocytes become activated and then start to become plasma cells. And it also has cortex and medulla. So these will be the criteria based on which we will distinguish between the different lymphatic organs. You can also see good old white adipose around here in the capsule. Subcapsular sinuses, also one telltale sign that this is the lymph node. So we saw the cortex. We recognized it by seeing lymphatic follicles. We saw the subcapsular sinus, the empty space just below the capsule. We saw the sinuses going between the follicles into the middle, into the medulla, and in the medulla we saw cords of cells and between them empty spaces for the flow of the lymph, the sinuses. Vas afferens would be the lymph vessels that you find in the capsule. I wouldn't worry about them too much. So lymph node with vas afferens going in here, the lymph traveling through to the medullary sinuses and out of the lymph node. So the point of this is you flow all the liquids from the tissues, the lymph, through this organ, and all the special immune cells, B and T lymphocytes, have the chance to see what's inside of all this liquid gathered from the tissues. So if there are antigens, if there are pathogens, these cells will become activated. So, and when the lymph node is very active, it will also be enlarged. So that's why, for example, if you're quite sick, you have enlarged lymph nodes on your neck, or it can even be in your armpits, stuff like that. So lymph node, number one. Second organ that we want to take a look at is the spleen. So spleen is much bigger organ, not just small lymph nodes, but it's a whole organ. You can live without it, but it's quite important. So it has, again, connective tissue capsule. We already saw this organ for the reticular connective tissue. So you can remember that maybe we saw the silver impregnation stain for spleen. And so it has a capsule and trabeculae, again, connective tissue going inside from the capsule. And as we already sort of mentioned before, it has two parts: the red pulp, where you will have the macrophages destroying the old red blood cells, and white pulp. And the white pulp is called white because it has the white blood cells, so that will be the part where the immune reaction is happening. So a little bit of the theory before we take a look at it. So we want to be able to recognize the white pulp and the red pulp in the spleen, and the white pulp is the lymphatic tissue. So how do you recognize lymphatic tissue is that you will see a lot of lymphocytes, and they will be organized in, again, lymphatic follicles. So this would be one lymphatic follicle, and same as before, in lymphatic follicles we will have B lymphocytes. So B dependent zone of this organ will be the lymphatic follicles in the white pulp. But we also have T lymphocytes, and T lymphocytes will be present in this dark blue area. So B lymphocytes here, here, and T lymphocytes will be in the place which is called pulse. And pulse stands for periarterial. So it's periarterial lymphatic sheath. So it's a sheath of lymphatic tissue surrounding this special artery. So blood vessels are in red here, and this artery is called the central artery. So we will be taking a look at those as well. So the central artery goes in the spleen, and around it you have the pulse, the sheath of T lymphocytes. So the T-dependent zone in white pulp of spleen is the pulse, periarterial lymphatic sheath. And B lymphocytes will be in the follicle. And this central artery is going inside the follicles. So it will be close to one another, the B and T dependent zone. And then we have marginal zone, which is the border between the white pulp and the red pulp, which is all the rest. So where you don't see the follicles, it's red pulp. Where you see the follicles, it's white pulp, and you have B lymphocytes here and T lymphocytes just around the central artery. In the marginal zone, you will have sinuses again, so spaces for the blood to go through. And you will have, of course, other immune cells present in this zone, macrophages and antigen-presenting dendritic cells. So this is kind of complicated, but the blood will come in through the trabecules. So again, from the capsule, it goes in. So the capsule contains blood vessels, and they go in through the trabecules. So the trabecules are part of the capsule that are going in. And from this, the central arteries are branching off, which are covered in pulse, T lymphocytes, and they go into the B lymphocyte dependent area, the lymphatic follicles. Then they go, the blood goes into the red pulp, which is where you destroy the dead red blood cells, the destroyed red blood cells that are no longer flexible enough. So the red pulp will be all the rest, which is not the lymphatic follicles, and it will be again sinuses. So blood going through vessels which are very wide, called the sinuses, and cords of cells. So we had medullary cords in the lymphatic lymph node, and we have splenic cord here. And these cords have a special name after some guy probably. So these are the cords of Billroth. So cords of Billroth will be in the red pulp. And notice I wasn't talking about cortex and medulla here. So in lymph node we had cortex and medulla. In spleen we don't have this kind of division. We have white pulp and red pulp. In white pulp you have the white blood cells. In the red pulp you are destroying the dying erythrocytes, and you therefore have a lot of macrophages and other immune cells as well. Macrophages which will show up in this brown color because they have a lot of the hemosiderin inside them, because they destroy a lot of hemoglobin from the red blood cells. So they could also be stained with the Pearl's reaction with Prussian blue that we already mentioned. So macrophages are non-specific immunity, and the specific immunity is located in the white pulp, the B and T lymphocytes. So what about questions? Where can we identify plasma cells? So you don't have to identify plasma cells. So first of all, for the plasma cells, you just have to recognize them on pictures from electron microscope. But they would be present, for example, in the activated centers of the B lymphocyte dependent areas, so the lymphatic follicles, or in the blood as well. And about the spleen question, do we have margin zone in human spleen? Yes, we have the margin zone. This is not a question about the reticular connective tissue. The reticular connective tissue is there all the time. So it's forming the I don't have the word. So the net of fibers which are holding all the lymphocytes and also forming the cords of Billroth. So margin zone is in the human spleen as well. I hope I answered the question. So let's move on. So this is white pulp and red pulp, and this is what it will look with hematoxylin eosine stain on the slide. So if you see the follicles, it will be white pulp, and the space between them, where you will see the sinuses and the cords of cells, will be the red pulp. The capsule will be, of course, on the edges, and the trabecules will be coming in. And when you see a trabecule which has a blood vessel in it, it will be a trabecular artery. So let's quickly take a look at the slide of spleen here. So can close this one, this one, this one. So spleen. Oh, I already had it open. So let's try the second one. So spleen, you can see no cortex and medulla. So it's everywhere quite the same, and you have follicles, white pulp and red pulp around them. So if we zoom in, so on the surface you see dense irregular connective tissue forming the capsule, and from the capsule you have trabecules. Let me find an example. Well, so the trabecules like this. So pieces of connective tissue that come from the capsule inside the tissue of the spleen. So this would be a trabecule going in. And then we should be able to find the lymphatic follicles. So this would be a lymphatic follicle, so B lymphocytes, and this area would be the red pulp where you don't see any follicles. So white pulp and red pulp. So let's take a look at the workbook. So for spleen, we should be able to see the trabecules. So that's easy, just connective tissue coming into the organ from the capsule. Trabecular artery or vein, so we will try to find blood vessels inside the connective tissue of the trabecules. We should be able to find white pulp, so we already did, and lymphatic follicle. We also will find the pulse, the periarterial lymphatic sheath with the T lymphocytes, and this pulse will be around the central artery. So when we find the central artery around it, we will have the pulse. So it's easy. Marginal zone of white pulp will be surrounding the follicle. We will take a look, and in the red pulp we want to see the cords of Billroth and the sinusoids or sinuses. It's the same thing. So if we take a look, for example, here we can see the white pulp very clearly. So this is the lymphatic follicle. Around it you have the marginal zone. So it's not very clearly defined, but it's here, just around the lymphatic follicle. And if we zoom in, we see the follicle, the activated center, and there's one blood vessel here. You can see that it's not located in the center of the follicle. However, it is called the central artery. So this is central artery. It will never be in the center. For some reason, it's still called this way. So it's quite small. So it's a small artery which is coming through the follicle, quite close to the center, but not in the center. Never right there. So this is the central artery, and therefore around it, this region will be the periarterial lymphatic sheath with T lymphocytes. So if you are asked to find T lymphocytes, point somewhere around the central artery. For B lymphocytes, point anywhere else in the lymphatic follicle. So if we go around, you can see that here we have central artery. Here we have central artery which is going like this. Here we have central artery. Here we have one. So every follicle will have the central artery, slightly off center, and around it you will have the pulse. So that's the central artery. I hope that's clear. Why does white pulp stain more blue? So if I zoom out, it seems like in this case, in hematoxylin eosine, it stains more pink, more reddish. That's because you don't have so many lymphocytes. So the lymphocytes, they have a big nucleus, which is purple, for stained with hematoxylin, and not much cytoplasm. So places where you have a lot of lymphocytes, the lymphatic follicles, they will be very purple, and the rest of it will be, normal hematoxylin eosine. So I think that's why this looks like this. So a red pulp will be everywhere here. So we saw the central artery, the white pulp, and the pulse around the artery. And now we also should find the trabecular artery, for example here. So if you see a piece of connective tissue, this is a trabecule cut across somehow like this, and inside it you can see a nice small artery. In this case there's more than just one vessel. So this would be a trabecular artery. So any blood vessel that you find inside this dense connective tissue, there you go. So that's quite easy. And inside the red pulp, so that would be here between one lymphatic follicle and the second one, you would have the cords of Billroth. So these are the cords of the cells. So this is one cord. It's quite messy, but the empty spaces are the sinuses. Sorry. So the sinuses in the red pulp, and they are between the cords of Billroth. So everywhere it seems more loose, more empty spaces with red blood cells. You can be sure that you are in the red pulp, and white pulp will have the follicle, central artery, pulse. So again, capsulated organ, secondary organ, so we have lymphatic follicles with B lymphocytes, we have T lymphocytes around the central artery, we have trabecules with trabecular arteries going in, and it doesn't have cortex and medulla, it just has white and red pulp. So that's it about the spleen. We still have thymus and the tonsil. The gult is not so complicated. So I don't know if we can continue for a little bit longer. Let me know if it's okay to extend the lesson a little bit, or if you have something else on schedule right after this, because it's probably best to cover it all together than to, you know, start from the beginning the next time. So please let me know if it's okay for me to continue a little bit longer. Maybe nobody's listening anymore. Because so we still have the primary lymphatic organ, the thymus, which is very different, but because it will have cortex and medulla again, and tonsilla palatina, which is the tonsil with the covering stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium, and just a lymphatic follicle in the large intestine. So what's the verdict? It's okay. Have a seminar. Okay. All right. Okay, so whoever has seminar afterwards, I'm sorry, but you can watch the rest of the video later on. It will remain accessible on this link, so you don't have to worry about it. And I will just cover this until the end, so that you know we have it all done, and you don't have to see me next week. So yes, so the pulse is made from T lymphocytes, yes, and the lymphatic follicle is made from B lymphocytes. So you understand it correctly. Perfect. So let's cover the rest of this topic, and so let's go. So this was spleen with the reticular connective tissue that we already saw impregnated with silver, and now we were able to see in hematoxylin eosin the white pulp, the red pulp, trabecules, capsule, trabecular artery, and central artery close to the center of the lymphatic follicle with the pulse around it, the T lymphocytes. So now the thymus. So thymus again has a capsule, so still capsulated, but this time it's primary lymphatic organ, and it doesn't have trabecules, but it has septa, which is similar. But the difference between trabecule and septum is that if you have the capsule and you have just a sort of a tube or something going in, it's called trabecule. But if you have a sheath of connective tissue going around, like 3D, you know, long, thin piece of connective tissue, is called a septum. So septa in thymus, they are, you know, longer, but trabecules, just one trabecule, second trabecule with the arteries inside them in the spleen. So that's the difference. It's still dense, irregular connective tissue. And in thymus, compared to a spleen, we will have cortex and medulla, and there will not be any lymphatic follicles, because this is not where you would be looking for B lymphocytes. This is not where the immune response is taking place. This is where the T lymphocytes are made and matured. So this organ also deteriorates as you age. So you will not have a huge thymus by now. You had it when you were little kids, and now it's turning more and more into fatty tissue in all of us. So yes, so on this picture from like low magnification you can already see that there are dark parts and lighter parts, and the dark parts will be the cortex and the light parts will be the medulla. So that's how you recognize the thymus, because this hasn't been the case in any of the other organs. We had cortex and medulla in lymph node, but there we had the lymphatic follicles in the cortex. Here, no lymphatic follicles. So cortex and medulla. And if we go more into the detail, so in thymus we have T lymphocytes. They are also called thymocytes because they are in the thymus and they are developing here. They are also accompanied by some kind of mesh that's between them. So the stroma in thymus is not reticular connective tissue. So in spleen we had reticular connective tissue impregnated with silver, blah blah blah, saw it already. But in thymus the function is similar, but these cells are not fibroblasts, not cells like this, but they are epithelial cells. They are called reticular epithelial cells that form the stroma. For the T lymphocytes, you also have macrophages that will be destroying the T lymphocytes that are not well developed and need to be destroyed. And there is a barrier between the thymus and the blood, because you need to regulate that only the well-developed, specifically activated T lymphocytes will be entering the bloodstream. Because at the beginning you make a lot of T lymphocytes and only some of them will be released into the blood because they are nicely functioning. What is happening is that the reticular epithelial cells, they serve as testing cells, because you need to know if the new T lymphocyte is reacting against your own body. That's what we don't want. That's how you get autoimmune diseases. So we don't want our own immune system to attack our cells. So you can test this by letting the T lymphocytes close to reticular epithelial cells, and if they react to them, if they want to, destroy our own cells, they are destroyed themselves. So only a very small part of the T lymphocytes that develop here are selected in this way and can enter the blood. So this is more theory. So let's skip this. We don't have time for more details. And in the medulla, there is something special called the Hassel's corpuscles. So these special keratinizing structures, it's not known what is their function. It's probably not functional at all, but these are the epithelial cells which are packed like this and keratinized. So Hassel's bodies or Hassel's corpuscles you will take a look at, and so the medulla is the part which is looser and lighter stained, and you will see these corpuscles there. You will also see more loosely packed lymphocytes, and there are a lot of macrophages. So let's see the slide. Yeah. So going back to the septa versus trabecules. Yes, the trabecules are just going in to the tissue and bringing the blood vessels, for example, there, and the septa are dividing the lobes of the organ. Perfect, you understand it perfectly. And so let's take a look before part of you have to leave, and let's take a look at the thymus. So thymus, here we even have adult and neonatal thymus for comparison, and so we want to focus on the neonatal thymus, which is the one that's still, you know, like fully functioning. So you can see darker areas, the cortex, and lighter areas, the medulla, and you can see connective tissue going around the organ and going in to the organ, dividing these lobes, and so this would be the septa. Connective tissue septa dividing the thymus into these lobes, and all of these lobes will have cortex and medulla. In the middle here you have a lot of connective tissue with blood vessels as well. So what do we need to see in the thymus slide is just cortex and medulla, very easy to recognize, and Hassel's bodies in the medulla, so the keratinized bundles of the epithelial cells. So let's zoom in. So all of these cells, like most of them are T lymphocytes, no follicles, but you have capsule, so easy to recognize the thymus. So this is the cortex, tightly packed T lymphocytes, they are being matured, and in the middle this would be the medulla, so more loose, and we should see the Hassel bodies. Let's see, maybe here. So if you don't find them in one region, just go somewhere else, and here you see a big piece of the medulla and a lot of them. So let's zoom in. So all of these round structures are the Hassel bodies. No special function, probably not that I know of, and they are the reticular epithelial cells bundled in like this. So you can see this only in thymus, you can see this anywhere else, and it's always in the medulla. So this is a nice one, I would say. So Hassel body, this is already the cortex, and this is the medulla. So that's all that you need to recognize on this slide. This would be a septum coming in from the capsule. So thymus is pretty straightforward, I would say. And let's move on. So the almost the last one, tonsilla palatina. So I already told you it's the one. For thymus I didn't say where it's located. So the thymus is located like around the sternum, but it's probably no longer like this big in our cases. So tonsilla palatina is the tonsils that you see when you open your mouth, and so this is also secondary lymphatic organ. So thymus was primary, all the rest that we saw are secondary, and it doesn't have a capsule around the whole thing, but it's only partially capsulated. And so they do not act as lymph filters, such as lymph nodes, for example, but they react to whatever is coming to them from the oral cavity. And so on the side which is facing the oral cavity, they are of course covered with the same epithelium as the rest of the space, so that's stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium, and from the lower side there's no epithelium. So that's why it's called partially capsulated. And you probably know that there are these holes that are going into these tonsils. So these are called crypts. They are blind, meaning they don't go anywhere. They are just holes inside, invaginations going inside the tonsil. And of course, this is the place where the immune reaction is taking place. So we will see lymphatic follicles with B lymphocytes. So this would be a nice example of the tonsil, of tonsilla palatina. How do you recognize this from, for example, thymus? Okay, no lobes with cortex and medulla. How do you recognize this is not the spleen? It's because it will not have the red and white pulp, it will not have the central arteries, and also it doesn't have the capsule going around it on all sides, because here the important thing to look for will be the epithelium on one side covering the tonsil. Also you don't have the subcapsular sinus there. And another important part will be the crypts going in to the tissue, and the crypts will be covered with the stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium as well. So it could look like this. This is not a very pretty picture. We will take a look at the slide as well. So the stratified squamous here, and the crypt is going into the tissue like this, still covered with the epithelium, and in the tissue you have the lymphatic follicles with the B lymphocytes. So let's take a look at the slide, and so where do we have it? Yes, palatine tonsil. So you can also have different tonsils, for example, in the respiratory tract, but we will only be looking at this one. So this is a very nice example. It's not always this nice on the slides. It's sometimes hard to find the stratified squamous, but here it's pretty clear. So if I zoom in to the surface here, I will see beautiful stratified squamous non-keratinizing. This could remind you of esophagus, for example. So we saw this kind of epithelium in esophagus. So stratified squamous non-keratinizing, and it's going in here into the tissue in these crypts. So invagination, the epithelium is still lining this part, and it's called the crypt. So that's where, you know, the pus is accumulating when the immune reaction is going on in your tonsils. White spots are filling these holes into the tonsil itself. And then you can see that on the other side there is no capsule, it's just continuing into the rest of the tissue of the, you know, wall of the oral cavity and your neck. And here you can see lymphatic follicles, so that's where you would find the B lymphocytes. So if you find stratified squamous covering the lymphatic tissue, it's for sure tonsilla palatina. We should be able to see the covering epithelium, we did. You should see the lymphatic follicles and the crypts. So that's it for tonsilla palatina. Nothing really too complicated. Lymphatic follicles, this would be one that's not activated. This one has the germinating center with the proliferation of the cells. So all of these are lymphatic follicles, a lot of B lymphocytes, so it's quite dark purple. The stratified squamous non-keratinizing epithelium, and the crypt going in here. So I hope that's septa divides. Why is it called partially capsulated? Because of covering epithelium? Yes. So the capsulated organs, they have something covering them from all sides. And the partially capsulated has a covering just from the side where it faces the inside of the oral cavity. So that's the partial capsule of it. So you have the epithelium covering it. That's it. And underneath it, of course, you have connective tissue here. What's the relevant? So what's the relevance of the crypts? The next question. So you need to enlarge the surface of the organ, which is facing the outer environment. So you ingest all kinds of stuff, and you need all the bacteria, the pathogens, to be able to reach the lymphatic organ here. So that's why the crypt is enabling you to enlarge the surface to for the tonsil to be able to react to more of these pathogens. So that's the relevance of the crypts. I hope that's clear. And yes, so for the lymphatic follicles, when they are just dark, they are not activated. When they have the activated, germinated center in the middle, they are activated, meaning they have already been activated by some antigen, and they are now producing more B cells, which will become plasma cells and produce antibodies. So that's it. Yes. And so we saw everything that we needed to see in the tonsil. And the last one today is the GALT, which is GI tract associated lymphatic tissue. So many abbreviations here, but so GALT is just lymphatic follicles or nodules. That's the same thing. So lymphatic nodules, so meaning accumulation of lymphatic cells in the wall of the intestine. And one example of this is where you have a large accumulation of these lymphatic nodules, and that's called Peyer's plaques or patches. So that's in the intestine, how it's called, when there's more of these aggregated lymphatic nodules in one place in the wall of the intestine. Yes, so getting back to the activated lymphatic follicles. So what's responsible for the contrast between the activated and non-activated? Heterochromatin. So be careful about in which magnification we are right now. So right now we are in light microscope, and there's no way to differentiate between heterochromatin and euchromatin in light microscope. You would need electron microscope. So it's true that the cells in the light part will have more euchromatin, but that's not what you see here. And the reason for it being lighter is simply that more cytoplasm of the cells and less densely packed lymphocytes, because the lymphocytes are just nuclei, a tiny bit of cytoplasm. So when it's the activated center, you have antigen presenting cells, so more cytoplasm of those. The plasma cells, more cytoplasm, so more pink compared to just the hematoxylin, the purple hematoxylin in the areas where you just have inactivated lymphocytes. So that's it. So let's take a look at the GI tract associated lymphatic tissue. What do we have in our workbook is that we just should find a lymphatic or lymphoid, same thing, follicle in the colon in this case. So let's take a look in histology guide, and that will be the last thing, and we're done. Yes, so also in this PDF that you have in on ViewCat that I showed you at the beginning from Lucy, you have many nice pictures for reviewing this, but it doesn't show the GALT, so let's try to find it here. So let's go to GI tract and let's let's see the large intestine. Let's see if we have some lymphatic tissue here. So this is the large intestine, so no villi, in the mucosa, just the crypts. And in between the crypts, connective tissue, which is in this case called lamina propria, and here is what we are looking for. So the accumulation of the lymphatic tissue will always, look like all the lymphatic tissue that we saw. So a lot of nuclei, very purple. So these are lymphocytes. We cannot tell if it's B or T lymphocytes, and they are forming this sort of accumulation, this follicle here, and it's in the lamina propria. So it's bulging into the submucosa, but it's like reaching into lamina propria because it needs to be close to the lumen, to where the antigens will be coming in, the pathogens, will be coming in. You can, no, they don't mention it in the legend here. So this is what you would be looking for. Here is another example, even with the activated center. So this is B dependent area. So in the lamina propria, you have a lot of accumulated lymphocytes waiting there to be activated by antigens presented to them, which come from the lumen. Let me see if this other one has a nice example as well. Yes. So you see the mucosa with the crypts, and here it will remind you of all the lymphatic organs that we saw. So all of these are lymphocytes sitting here in the lamina propria. So this is GALT, GI tract associated lymphatic tissue. It's quite easy to find, and you can find pieces of this also in the respiratory tract. So lymphatic follicles just inside the lamina propria in the respiratory tract as well. So I think we are the end. Yes, good question again here. So okay, sorry. So then we have a question. Can you once more say which type of connective tissue is below epithelial layer of tonsilla palatina? So it will be a dense irregular, I think. First, you will have a little bit of loose. It's similar to esophagus. So you will have first lamina propria, and then you will have a little bit of dense irregular. Let me show you. Yeah, lamina propria. So mostly loose, I think. Let me go back. So lymphoid system. So you can based on what you see, you can tell usually what kind of connective tissue it is. So you will have lamina propria, so a little bit of loose connective tissue, and then a little bit of dense irregular. Because here you see a lot of collagen type 1. But there will for sure be a little bit of loose connective tissue just underneath the epithelium, normal lamina propria, as the rest of oral cavity and the esophagus. So I think that's clear. And no Paneth cells in the colon. Yes, there are Paneth cells in the colon. So the same as in the small intestine. Oh, this is very crappy picture. But yes, there will be Paneth cells at the lower parts of the crypts. It's the same. We just were looking at them in the small intestine, but it stays the same. So Paneth cells are still here. Good question. Only in small intestine? Well, now I am confused. Paneth cells, large intestine. I'm sorry, I'm not 100% sure. Oh, so I'm sorry. Yes. So if we can trust Wikipedia, which we probably can in this case, they are only in the small intestine. So I'm sorry. So don't believe me. Like usually you can believe me, but I'm sorry. Yes. So no Paneth cells in the large intestine. So only in the small one. In the only small one. Maya is right. I'm not. So sorry about this. And so we are done with the specific immune system. At the end of the presentation, it's not in the one that you have now, but because I added it just before I started the stream, but I will add it there as well. There's a table which can help you like with distinguishing between the different lymphatic organs based on, you know, if they have capsule or not, if they have cortex and medulla or not, and stuff like that. So subcapsular sinus, for example, which is only in the lymph node. So it could be helpful. So I will add it and update the presentation for you in a while. So that's it for today. We are half an hour late. I'm very sorry for that, but if you didn't catch the end of this talk, you can do it later on the same link. So thank you for your attention. If you have any more questions, you can email me. So my email is on the website of the department, so you don't have to worry about it. Or you can ask more questions here, but I think we are done. I'm exhausted. I think you are probably too. So we covered 2 practices today, super effective, and so you can just, you know, repeat the histology next week, and nothing really new for you. So that's it from me, and you're welcome. You're welcome. So see you next time.